Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program for Monday, September 13th. It's exciting to be here. We have a lot of people coming to this evening's webinar. It's titled Information Hunters, When Librarians, Soldiers, and Spies Banded Together in World War II Europe. It is a live presentation by Kathy Pice. We are going to be getting started in just a moment or so. We're going to give some time for the people in the waiting room to make their way into the webinar. So just sit back, relax, and be patient. We will be starting in a moment or two. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. If you're here for the Book Club of California's live online program titled Information Hunters, When Librarians, Soldiers, and Spies Banded Together in World War II Europe, you're in the right place. We're going to be getting started in just a moment or so. We're going to give another minute, maybe a little bit more than a minute of time for folks to make their way in from the waiting room, and then we're going to begin. So just sit back, relax, be a little patient. Again, we'll be starting in just a moment or so. Thanks. Okay, it's just a few minutes past the top of the hour, and I think we're going to get started. We'll let people join us in progress. So good evening, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled Information Hunters, When Librarians, Soldiers, and Spies Banded Together in World War II Europe. This is a live online presentation by Kathy Pice, author and the Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols Professor of American History at the University of Pennsylvania. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host the webinar this evening. Tonight, we have more than 200 people registered for this presentation. So for those of you who might be new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do this with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, history, and much, much more. If you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many, and we simply cannot do the work that we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or to donate to the Book Club of California. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. Program, again, is titled Information Hunters, When Librarians, Soldiers, and Spies Banded Together in World War II Europe. This is a live online presentation by Kathy Pice. She is an author and the Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols Professor of American History at the University of Pennsylvania. Kathy Pice teaches courses on modern American cultural history and the history of American sexuality, women, and gender. Her research has examined the history of working women, working class and interracial sexuality, leisure, style, and popular culture, the beauty industry in the US and abroad, and libraries, information, and American cultural policy during World War II. She's particularly interested in the ways that culture shapes the everyday lives and popular beliefs of Americans across time. She's the author of Cheap Amusements, Working Women and Leisure in Turn of the Century New York, published in 1986, and Hope in a Jar, The Making of America's Beauty Culture in 1998, which was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award. Other books include Zoot Suit, The Enigmatic Career of an Extreme Style, published in 2011, and Major Problems in the History of American Sexuality, published in 2001. Her articles have appeared in numerous publications, including Library Trends, Business History Review, and Social Problems, among others. Now, Pice has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the NEH, the ACLS, the Smithsonian Institution, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She is a fellow of the Society of American Historians and served on the Society's executive board. She has also lectured at the University of Sydney as a Fulbright Senior Specialist. In addition to writing and teaching, she has served as a consultant to museums, archives, and public history projects, and appeared in the documentary films New York and Miss America. Now, tonight, she will talk about her latest book, titled Information Hunters, When Librarians, Soldiers, and Spies Banded Together in World War II Europe, which was from Oxford University Press, published in 2020. Now, Information Hunters explores the uses and meaning of print culture in a time of war and devastation. Originating in the hidden story of a family member, Information Hunters reveals the efforts of American librarians, scholars, and archivists to find and preserve books and documents for national security, military planning, and post-war reconstruction. Information Hunters received the 2021 DeLong Book History Book Prize from the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing, also known as SHARP, S-H-A-R-P. Now, if you have questions for our presenter, please use the chat and the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have some time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those questions from the Q&A. And now, it's my great pleasure, after that long introduction, to introduce Kathy Pice and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Kathy, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to everyone who's attending this webinar. I'm really thrilled that so many of you are interested in this subject. As Kevin mentioned, I got into this project in part through the life of a family member. This was the older brother of my father, whose name was Reuben Pisces, and he was a librarian at Harvard during right before World War II. And when the war broke out, he joined the Office of Strategic Services, which was the first centralized intelligence agency in the United States. And after the war, he became the head of a mission of the Library of Congress. In this photograph on the top of my book, you see a man with a pipe in the middle. That is Reuben Pisces. I knew nothing about his life and stumbled upon this story. And as one thing leads to another, I discovered, in fact, that there were many people, librarians, archivists, curators, bibliophiles, who were involved in World War II, focused on documents and books as part of their war effort. They went into neutral cities to acquire material for intelligence purposes. They looked for books that had Nazi and militaristic content, and they recovered millions of looted books that had been stolen by German soldiers and others, mainly from Jewish institutions and libraries. So I'm going to tell you this story tonight, and I will look forward to your questions and comments at the end. So this story begins really with these two men. They were sort of an odd couple. One of them on the left, William J. Donovan, known as Wild Bill Donovan, was a Republican politico and a World War I hero who became quite friendly with Franklin Roosevelt. And as the war clouds gathered in the 1930s, he began to push Roosevelt to create an organization that would centralize information gathering and analysis for security purposes. Not yet thinking about the war, but anticipating perhaps that the United States would be involved in it. He became close to the Librarian of Congress at the time, who was Archibald MacLeish, whom you may know as a well-known poet and playwright prior to his becoming the Librarian of Congress. The two men sat on MacLeish's porch in Washington in the summer of 1941 and planned how to bring intelligence materials to the United States, which was woefully unprepared for the war. As Librarian of Congress, there were ways that MacLeish saw a great library giving a certain kind of authority and expertise to the gathering of information. Now, Donovan was appointed by Roosevelt to be the head of an organization that he called the Coordinator of Information. This was right before the OSS was started. And I would underscore that word, information. Information is a word that is so common to us today, but in fact, in the early 20th century, it was a concept that was beginning to take off and beginning to gain interest, not only among librarians, but also among a burgeoning group of people who would later be called information scientists. There was an international dimension to this, an idea that you could gather together all knowledge, have universal knowledge that would be shared by all nations, and that would in fact be oriented towards fostering peace and understanding. And one such organization, the Mundaneum, was founded in Belgium with this idea of gathering all knowledge. But by the 1930s, there was a great emphasis on nationalism, as we know from around the world. And even in the United States, there were a number of institutions created that were essentially national institutions, the National Gallery of Art being one, and the National Archives, under construction here in 1934, the first time all of the federal records were gathered together in one place. As the war developed, early in the war, the idea of getting war information was one that became commonplace across the United States. Public libraries created within themselves war information centers and provided information about defense industries, about the progress of the war and the like. And so this idea of information was a really important one. It was growing at this time. The real question for Donovan and MacLeish was how to gather information from abroad. What kind of knowledge could be gained by collecting publications, periodicals, industrial directories, and the like. This was before there was a capability of doing real espionage, of putting human beings into these places to gather human intelligence. MacLeish, I think, gained an insight into how to do this from one of his librarians, whose name was Jose Meyer, and who is basically unknown. I discovered her deep in the archives of the Library of Congress, and I could not even find a photograph of her. But Jose Meyer was a librarian who was based in Paris, working part-time as the representative of the Library of Congress, as well as the publishing house Hachette. And she was in Paris as the threat of German invasion was happening. She was told by the people back home, oh, don't worry, nothing is going to happen. And of course, she found herself stuck in Paris when the Germans marched in June of 1940. And Meyer, whose passport had expired and didn't have very much money, felt that she was in fact stuck. And rather than just hiding out, she decided to become on her own an intelligence agent. She took photographs of the occupation. There's a sort of fuzzy one there on the bottom right. She did an investigation of publishing houses, bookstores and libraries, and what the German occupiers were doing to remove what they saw as books that were not pro-German or were written by Jewish authors. And she even was able to get a copy of what was called the List Otto, which was a list of books that the Germans banned from French bookshops and libraries. She borrowed it from a gendarme who loaned it to her overnight, and she copied it and sent it on to Washington. And Archibald MacLeish was just astounded by what she was able to do. She was really the first person to bring this information about the cultural attack that the German occupation was engaged in. So when the United States entered the war, the OSS, William Donovan, working closely with the Library of Congress, decided that it would place a number of agents in neutral cities around the world. In Europe, this was especially Stockholm and Lisbon, but there was also outposts in Cairo, in Chongqing, and in New Delhi, among a few other places. And I'm going to highlight two of these sites, one of them in Stockholm, which was headed by, it's the only woman involved in this kind of wartime intelligence mission. Her name was Adele Kuyper, a very interesting woman who grew up, she grew up in Hollywood actually, and her parents were connected to the film industry. She herself was an academic, and she went to the University of Chicago and earned a PhD in medieval linguistics in 1930, which is very rare for women at that time. She couldn't get a job as an academic in the United States, and she went to Europe, essentially working for professors who wanted to have rare books and manuscripts copied from library, like the Vatican Library, the British Library, etc. And so she learned actually how to photograph material, first using a regular camera, and over time learning how to use a microfilm camera. And she was sent over to Stockholm to head up a unit that was known as the Anglo-American Microfilm Unit, which was a cooperative effort of the British and the United States. The British brought in numerous current newspapers, scientific periodicals, and journals. There was literature from the Danish resistance, and other items like that. And Kuyper, with a small team of people based in the American legation in Stockholm, worked on this massive microfilming operation. And what they did was to microfilm approximately 3,000 reels of materials and send them back to Washington and to London to be analyzed by intelligence analysts. She was a somewhat reserved person. I think she took to the secret life very well, and her bosses, her male bosses, were very worried about whether she was really up to the job. Turns out she was the most successful of all of the agents who were sent to do this work. And there is some evidence based on something that her family stories, essentially, that she did some covert activities as well, which I can't prove, but family stories are often quite true. Another location for the gathering up of books, periodicals, and other kinds of publications was Lisbon. And Lisbon, you may know, was the center of all spies, the place where all spies gathered during World War II. Portugal was a neutral country. It had sympathies with the Germans, but it had a very long-standing treaty with the British. And so it was kind of walking very carefully on maintaining its neutrality. And everyone came into Lisbon seeking information. And among them were librarians from the United States, including my father's brother, Reuben Pisces. And this is the only photograph I have of him from the war years. It was buried in a folder at the Harvard University archives, which he had been at the Harvard Library before joining the OSS. There were a lot of propagandists operating at this time. There were German propaganda stores. This here on the upper right is a British propaganda newsstand. And there were also very helpful bookstore owners, including the Livraria Portugal. Those owners were Allied sympathizers and would help the Americans gather together books from Germany and other publications that would be hard for them as Americans to acquire. They even, the bookstore owners even went to Spain, which was quite dangerous for Americans, and pretended to be taking these books or purchasing these books for their own bookstore, but then turned them over to the Americans, who microfilmed them in great numbers and sent those microfilms back to the United States. One of the upshots of this activity of acquiring foreign publications was that there was so much material that it was overwhelming. The material wasn't organized well on the microfilm, and there were about 20 wartime agencies that received the microfilms, but found them almost impossible to use because they needed massive numbers of people to sort through them. And so one thing that happened during this time was that a large number of women and emigres were hired by the OSS to do a subject index of these microfilms so that they could be, the topics could be rapidly found, and to provide abstracts and even full text translations in 16 different languages. So it became a, from a handful of people, it became a massive operation during the war. After D-Day, when American and Allied troops landed on the continent, this collecting mission changed pretty dramatically. The change was essentially that groups of librarians and intelligence agents and soldiers would follow behind the advancing troops, and knowing a whole set of targets, having lists of targets, they would go to each of these targets and try to gather up all of the information that they could. They would, go to a Nazi party headquarters, for example, and take all of the names and cards and other kinds of documentary evidence. This man here in the photograph, Lee Finney, was a very interesting individual who was engaged in this kind of effort. He was a modernist composer. You can hear his work on YouTube. It's really quite striking. And he was a professor of music at Smith College when he was enlisted by Archibald MacLeish to, he was told, oh, you might want to be involved in this kind of activity. And he went to Paris, and essentially he learned how to be an intelligence agent. And he's one of the few people we have a detailed description of what he was doing, because he wrote his wife letters, which were preserved in his papers at the New York Public Library. And he writes about how he learned how to, requisition trucks. He learned how to interrogate people. He learned how to follow people down streets, and essentially how to acquire materials that were very different from acquiring books in Northampton, Massachusetts, as he put it. These were known as T forces, the T for target. As the Allies advanced into Germany, they began to find vast quantities of books and other publications stored in tunnels, caves, salt mines, churches, many different locations around Germany. These photographs on the bottom here are two pictures of the Ransbach mine that was filled with library books from the Prussian State Library. And this is only one of about a dozen sites in which this state library had been relocated to take it away, to save it from Allied bombing of Berlin. So the Allies, and especially the Americans, because much of this was in the zone where the Americans would be taking over, had a real challenge on their hands. What were they going to do with all these books? This was an unanticipated problem, and they needed to do something about it. So when the war ended, in Europe at least, the libraries themselves, which had been, they were cooperating, the American libraries were cooperating with the American government in all sorts of ways. I mean, they were deeply committed to the war effort, as were so many institutions at this time. When the war ended, however, their collecting juices began to flow, and the leading research libraries, Harvard, New York Public, Yale, and many state university libraries began to think about how to get their collectors or dealers back into Europe in order to acquire books that they'd been published during the war years, but they had not been able to acquire because the book trade had basically stopped. So they're kind of jockeying for position with each other. And one of the things I was surprised to find was that, you think of librarians as a kind of genteel profession. Well, no, they were very, very anxious to get in there and get material. The one library that was extremely successful at doing this was the Hoover Institution Library, which had been founded by President Herbert Hoover back actually in the World War I period. And it had been founded as a library that collected materials related to war, peace, and revolutions. Hoover, of course, as a former president, had many, many friends and colleagues and knew many people from the post-World War I period. And he was able to get his collectors into Germany and to parts of France that were quite devastated by war damage, and in which the military really did not want librarians running around. Here's a photograph, one of the few photographs I have of two of his collectors, Louis Lochner and Frank Mason, who were both journalists, and they were collecting for him on the side. And one of the ways that they did this collection actually was by offering care packages to German civilians who were very, very hungry. I mean, this was a period in which there was, Germans were allocated very few calories. There was the winter of 1945-46 was a very dire winter for them. And so people would trade their diaries or their records, personal records, or other kinds of materials for these food packages. So the success of the Hoover Library getting into Europe not only the other libraries were upset, but the military was not very happy either. And so the Library of Congress made a proposal to essentially serve as a kind of common collector for all of the American research libraries. And they had a team of people that was known as the Library of Congress Mission to Europe. As I said at the beginning, it was headed by my uncle, Reuben Pisces, there in the center. He was already in Europe working for the OSS, for the intelligence agency, and he was just transferred over to the Library of Congress. And there was a whole team of other fascinating librarians. And to me, one of the most interesting is the elderly gentleman, second from the right, Harry Leidenberg, who had been the director of the New York Public Library and was a great leader in the library field. And he went to occupied Germany, war-torn Germany, at 70 years old, and was just this amazing kind of force of nature while he was there. Now, the Library of Congress Mission's initial charge was to buy 3 copies of every book that had been published in Germany or in occupied countries. And this was difficult to do because there wasn't a lot of book stocks. Many book stocks had been destroyed by bombs or had disappeared or been sent away to caves and the like, and they were hard to find. So the mission, in a way, was transformed by the efforts of those documents teams and T-forces working with the American intelligence agencies. They had millions of items to sort of screen to see whether they were useful or not. And so the Library of Congress mission essentially became the screeners of all of this material, and anything that was not useful for the intelligence or wartime agencies, that material could be sent back to the United States, ultimately to be distributed among American research libraries. There was also a kind of expansion of the mission that took place just because these were people who were fascinated by the written record. They wanted to preserve the history of Nazism, and they found themselves in all sorts of places where materials were just there or had been hidden. There was a vast photograph collection that was hidden in a bathroom in a restaurant. And the question, what do we do with this photograph collection? Some argued it should be sent back to the United States because it had Nazi content. Ultimately, it was screened, and the photographs that did not have Nazi content stayed in Germany, and those that did went to the United States. These two pictures are of Library of Congress mission agent Don Travis and a German librarian, Hans Bielheck, who were just sorting through this kind of mess of papers, ephemera, looking for posters, pamphlets, other kinds of documents that had been gathered by one of the great collectors of Nazi material during the Nazi era. So this became a kind of almost a crazy sort of collecting mission, and much of this material landed back at the Library of Congress, even though the Library of Congress had never been really intended to be to acquire this kind of documentary ephemeral material. There were two other activities that the American librarians and collectors were involved in the post-war period that I think were really important aspects of their work. One had to do with the denazification of Germany. There was obviously an effort to denazify, demilitarize, and try to create a democratic citizenry so that Germany could be essentially released from the its commitment to the sort of virus of Nazism, as they put it, and become a legitimate state. One of the things that was a high focus of the Allied post-war planners was that book collections needed to be denazified. There was a strong belief that books were a danger to the German people, that books had contributed to this kind of ideological fervor that had fostered Nazism. And so even at the very end of the war, there were orders out to seize books with Nazi or militaristic content in publishing houses, in bookstores, and in schools. They were really concerned about school children, and to remove those and sequester them, put them in locked rooms. Over time, this kind of removal of material began to be seen as not sufficient, and the push really came from the Soviet allies and the French allies to really make an effort to destroy all Nazi-related material. And so in May of 1946, an order was issued by the four powers to not only to confiscate, but to destroy any books, other materials with a Nazi or militaristic content, not only in bookstores and publishing houses and schools, but also in public libraries. And this order hit the American press at this time, and there was an outcry, as you can imagine, from librarians, certainly around the country, as well as journalists and some members of Congress. As you can see from the wartime poster on the far left, there was a strong idea that the American mission in the war was to defend freedom, the freedom to read, the freedom to think, essentially our Bill of Rights. And so the idea that the Allies were now destroying books, as this journalist put it, that Nazi books were going to be burned, that seemed to be sort of replaying the, what was wrong with Nazism and its efforts to suppress intellectual life. And so, I mean, the military occupation government was a bit clueless. They kept saying, we're not burning books, we're just pulping the books for paper pulp, which we really need. And so the Library of Congress mission kind of came in and said, here, let's here's a kind of solution to this problem. We will preserve up to 150 copies of every single one of these books to be used as record copies for further research and for preserving the history of this horrible regime and period of history. And the rest of those materials would be destroyed. And so these librarians found themselves in this kind of strange position of actually making decisions to destroy books. It seems not what we'd expect of librarians, but that was the decision that was made at this time. Now, these books came to the United States, the ones that had been set aside, and they were distributed to American research libraries, along with the other German confiscated material that I spoke of just earlier. So many libraries around the country received boxes of books that either had Nazi content to them or that had reflected in some way on German history, philosophy, political affairs, and the like. The other activity that I think in many ways is the most powerful and meaningful is the question of what to do with all of the books that had been found buried and hidden away, especially those that had been looted by German ideologists. There was an effort on the part of Alfred Rosenberg, who was this sort of German leader and wanted to start an institute for the study of what he called the Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question. He was going to create the world's largest and most complete Jewish library of Jewish texts. And there are also many thefts from the SS as well. These books were not, it was not really anticipated that they were going to be found. There was an expectation they were just going to be destroyed. But in fact, many of them had been preserved. And the Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt, the building itself had been destroyed, but the cellars contained over 100,000 books and many, many Torah scrolls, as you can see from this photograph of Chaplain Samuel Blinder looking at them. This cellar had been discovered by a Jewish soldier who essentially looked up the address of this institute in the phone directory and took a Jeep over there and found scraps of paper with Hebrew on them that led to a cellar, a door to a cellar. Even more items were found in a small village about 50 miles outside of Frankfurt called Hungen. And there are about 2 million items found there, piled up in cellars, on decks above that had been built in a churchyard, in a tax office, just a vast quantity of material. And you can see the way it was all thrown together. So the Americans were faced with something they really did not expect. They knew that they were going to be dealing with looted art. They were already investigating that issue, but they really had not counted on all of these books. And it was, in fact, a huge challenge that the famous group called the Monuments Men, the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives unit of the Army, was handed to deal with. About 6 months went by, and there was an effort to try to gather these materials in what was called the Rothschild Library Collecting Point. This had been a public library once owned by the Rothschild family. There was some bomb damage to the building, but it was not too excessive. There wasn't enough military staff to deal with this issue, and so the military government basically handed over the process of trying to identify and sort material to an American civilian who had been in Germany when the war broke out, had been in concentration camps actually, and then released. He was something of a German scholar. His name was Glenn Goodman. And here's a photograph of him with one of the great Dutch restitution officers, Dirk Graswinckel, who went all over this area looking for the materials that had been looted from the Dutch, which were quite valuable and extensive. After about 6 months of difficulty getting this, getting anything going, basically everything kind of shut down. And in 6 months, not a single book had actually been sent back to its country of origin. Finally, some military officers were put in charge of this effort, and the books were all gathered together in a very large warehouse in Offenbach, outside of Frankfurt, across the river from Frankfurt. It was called the Offenbach Archival Depot. It should have been called the Book Depot, but it was called the Archival Depot. The first person in charge was Seymour Pomerantz, and he was followed by Isaac Benkowitz. They were both military officers with command experience and both Jewish Americans, and very dedicated to trying to identify and restitute these millions of books. And you can see on the bottom the image of the books just being piled up in crates, waiting to be handled. Essentially, what these two men did was to create a kind of warehouse system, almost like an industrial system of identifying and moving books from one floor to another, packing them in crates and putting them onto barges to be shipped to their countries of origin. It was Isaac Benkowitz actually who came up with the brilliant idea of how to do a first identification of many books. I mean, if you can think about opening 2 million books and trying to identify them, especially because the workers were German civilians, and many of these books were in languages that these Germans could not read. Benkowitz sat there for a while trying to sort books, and what he realized was that you could rapidly identify a number of books based on their book stamps or ex libris book plates. And so he had all of those stamps and plates photographed and put into albums. As you can see, here's an example on the right-hand side of the screen. And each of those book stamps or plates had a number next to it. Every worker would memorize, some of them were really good at memorizing this, and they'd memorize 20, others would memorize 6. And when they recognized a book plate or a stamp, they would put it into that book. And that was the way that the initial sorting occurred. And they could even sort about 30,000 books in a day through this really remarkable technique. Simple, but remarkable. Even so, by the, after all of those had been sorted, there were many books that were not identifiable. And the question of what to do with them was one that was a political question as well as an ethical question. And I don't have time today to really go into detail. It's its own story, but just to highlight 2 of the people involved. Again, I sort of focus on the women because they're not as visible, I think, as many of the men are. One of them, Lucy Shiltrat, later known as Lucy Davidovich, her married name, and a great Jewish American historian. She found herself at Offenbach. She was doing other work, but found herself at Offenbach and was asked to basically spend 4 months trying to identify books without those stamps or book plates. And she had known from personal experience about collections in Vilna, especially the Yivo collections. And she was able to identify thousands of books, which later went to Yivo, which was reconstituted in New York City during the war. Another key figure here is one that I'm sure is familiar to all of you, the political philosopher Hannah Arendt, who was the executive director and research director of an organization, Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, which was a US-based but international organization that tried to make a claim to be the agency to distribute these books that could not be identified. They wanted to restore Jewish heritage, Jewish culture in places where there were living Jews. And so ultimately, the American government gave Jewish Cultural Reconstruction permission to distribute those books, and many of them went to Israel and to the United States, but to other countries around the world as well. So I'll conclude very quickly with just a few words about the legacies of these wartime collecting missions. One of them is that information science really began to take off. The war experience pushed a number of people to imagine what information management and science could be post-war. There were even early experiments to work with computer cards, such as the one on the top. That was an OSS experiment. There was this dream of something that in a way was a kind of preliminary version of a personal computer that was imagined by the scientist Vannevar Bush. But more practically, there were individuals who were involved in the acquisition of foreign publications and managing them, who became post-war leaders in information science. One of them, Eugene Power, who taught many people how to do microfilm under great stressful situations. He founded University Microfilm, which ultimately became the company ProQuest, the giant digital company. And the other on the far right is Frederick Kilgore, who was the one person that I got to talk to. He was still alive when I got to talk to him. He was in his 90s. He had recruited my uncle into the OSS. He became the creator of what is known as OCLC. It's the networking of library catalogs electronically, and that ultimately became the giant database WorldCat, which we all depend upon. There were many books, as I said, that wound up in American libraries. There's a couple of items from the collections at the University of Pennsylvania, 2 books with Nazi content that were basically detective stories and historical romances. They were basically cheap fiction that were kind of an embarrassment to the library at Penn, but they are there, they're in the archive. As well as books that came from Jewish cultural reconstruction. And you can see the book stamp there, which honors not only the people and books that had been lost, but also those who had recovered and saved and continued Jewish culture. Many of these books are little known. They're hidden on shelves. But there are increasing efforts to make them known. This is a mapping project that was started by the Center for Jewish History and my university, University of Pennsylvania. And my own book, I hope, is just one step in us getting to know this important wartime story about books and their meaning in a time of devastation. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm back. Wow, I was taking some furious notes, and then you ended, so I had to jump back in. And I'm going to use this time to call everyone who is still here, still participating and listening, to put your questions now up in the chat and the Q&A. There's some already in there, but if you have a question, please, or a comment, please put it in there. Now's the time. I have a bunch of questions as well. I've already looked at the chat and the Q&A, so I think we're going to have a nice little conversation here. First of all, thank you so much for sharing the incredible stories of all of these information hunters. I mean, there's so many fascinating individuals that on their own warrant probably a whole book or chapter just about each individual and what they did and what role they played. And I think my first question is, like, how dangerous was this work for them? I mean, we think of spies, right, and all espionage as very dangerous occupations or roles. Did you find out a lot about the dangers that each, one or two, you can select whoever you like, how dangerous it was for them? Were they at risk of being caught or, arrested?
Yeah, there was some risk, and they did not have secret names. They went under diplomatic passports or under their own passports, essentially as people from the Library of Congress. So they could just say, oh, I'm a book collector. I'm not a spy, I'm a book collector. And they're not, some of them I think were actually doing on the edges of doing espionage, and they were in some danger. Lee Finney, while he was on a collecting mission, stepped on a landmine, and he was okay. He got a lot of shrapnel from it. So he was the one who I think experienced the greatest physical danger, but I think there was always a threat of, potentially being taken in by the secret police and questioned.
Interesting. So the other question, I didn't do all of my thanks. First of all, thank you. That was so fascinating. I totally want to hear more about all the aspects of what they did, how they did it, where these books went, how they, that whole part about, sorting and identifying them based on their book plates, and that whole process was, I don't know, there's lots of questions there, because I was wondering, how did they do that? How long did it take to do that? I mean, there were millions of books, I think you said, that were there in that repository that they went through. How did that end? I mean, eventually it closed down, I guess. There's not still books that people are going through to try to move on, right? They were eventually dispersed to new homes.
Right. So first I should say that the Americans dealt with the books that were in the American zone of occupation. There were many books that we know in the Soviet zone of occupation, and they were removed back to the Soviet Union, and that's where they are today. The books in the American zone, I mean, the sorting process, actually, once they got this thing going, they sorted the ones that had come in the first round in about 9 months. And the rules of restitution was that any book would be restituted to the country of origin, not to individuals. So that, and then the country would restitute them to the individual. So you can see there's room for slippage here. There were also many, something like 300, 400,000 that could not be identified. And these were simply divided up. Israel was given sort of first selection because they were building libraries, and any book that was unique to them went there. Other books came to the United States, went to Jewish seminaries, universities, and some non-Jewish institutions as well. So the process was fast. It wasn't, it's not like they were having inventory. I mean, you cannot find an inventory list, right, for example. I mean, it happened very quickly. They were really, they felt a real need to just, let's get this thing done. It's really important, but let's get it done. And so, some mistakes were made and books had to be sent back. And I think there also are many books still in German private hands or in university libraries that got folded into their collections. And there are efforts to find those books.
There's a question about German institution and collectors today maybe requesting the return of materials that were removed or somewhere else. And what's that like? And how are US libraries and institutions responding to these other entities and countries that are requesting materials be returned to them?
Yes, in the case of Germany, there have not been requests to return the Jewish looted material. There have been requests to return other materials that had been improperly taken, I think, by the Library of Congress mission or by others, by the military intelligence agencies. And those have been sent back. When they're identified, they've been sent back. There were sort of laws rulings about the Jewish materials. And there really isn't, if there are German Jews who have a claim on anything that went to American libraries, how that is negotiated is often through the Jewish Claims Conference, which handles these kinds of issues. But there are many people still looking for their collections. And I will say in our own, we have a library in a Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. There's a librarian who got kind of turned on by my asking all these questions and trying to find these books. And he's been doing shelf checking and has found over 1,000 books that came from Jewish cultural reconstruction that are not listed in the catalog, just by going one by one on a shelf. Yeah, so there's a lot that we don't know, and that's still hidden.
Yeah, so someone also asked a question in the chat, was a question I had when you were talking about the care boxes, how they would exchange a care box for like someone's personal diary or books that they had. I mean, is there any effort to get those personal like diaries and journals back to those people, or where did that kind of fall into this whole mix?
Yeah, I think that I don't know of any instance of this, and this would be largely a question of the Hoover Institution Library and whether they've received those requests, and they're fairly non-disclosing about their collecting practices. I actually found most of this information not at the Hoover Institution, but at Hoover's Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa, where it was hidden under some other category of activity. So I don't know if there have been efforts to get any of those materials returned. That's a great question.
Yeah, you're an information hunter too.
Yes, very much.
Tell us a little bit about, I mean, you named a lot of the institutions and libraries that, you did some research at. How extensive was that? I mean, I wrote down the New York Public Library, the Harvard Library, the Hoover Library, also family stories you mentioned. You got to interview people. So tell us about that and how long and extensive that was.
Yeah, well, this project took me a very long time. I mean, I do have a day job, so it's not like I could work on it every day. But I mean, part of it is that this was a field entirely new to me, as you can tell from my other book titles. My other work was in different fields, and so I had a lot to learn about the war, about intelligence, about book and library history. I spent an enormous amount of time at the National Archives and had great help from archivists there. The records are hard to navigate. Some of those materials have been digitized, and that's been really great. I spent also a lot of time at the Library of Congress. Let's see, research trips to the University of Virginia, University of Illinois, which has the American Library Association papers. Yeah. I went out to Saskatchewan to a collection at the University of Regina, which had to do with monuments men. And I did a lot of work at the British National Archives as well. So it took me in many different directions, and I didn't really know what it was about until fairly close to the end. Then I began to see all of the connections. It took me a very long time to piece it together. So let's start with the inspiration, which was your family, right? Reuben Pisces. How did you first become aware of his role and what he did? And I mean, those are great photos that he is actually in. That is just amazing on the cover of the book. So how did that like spark this whole journey to do all this research? Yes, well, I was doing a Google search on something pertaining to my father, and I used the Boolean operators to take myself out of the search, and came up with an obituary, a memorial to him on the University of California website for Reuben Pisces. And I just sort of sat back and I read this, and he was in the OSS. He was the head of the Library of Congress mission, and he died at age 40. So he died before I was born, very young, tragically. And I started to dig around, read his, he had a few publications, and I finally called my parents and I said to my father, well, what can you tell me about your oldest brother? And he said, oh, we were on other sides of the world during the war. I was in the Pacific, he was in Europe. I really didn't know much about it. And then my mother gets on the phone and says, oh, yes, Reuben was a spy. So like, why did I never know that? And so that was, they didn't really know very much about this aspect of his life. I had a few stories from my mother, which were borne out in other documents. And he left a pretty vast paper trail at different archives around the country.
Yeah, I imagine. Oh, it just happened over like a family reunion over barbecue. Someone mentioned him, and then it just led you down this incredible journey. That's cool. So the photos that you used in the presentation, I'm guessing many of them are in the book. Is that
Yes.
So what was that like to get the rights for all those photos? And I mean, that seems incredibly hard to do.
Well, actually, unlike the book on cosmetics, where I had like a terrible time getting permissions, in this case, the photographs had, not all of them, but the vast majority had been taken by federal agencies. And so they are in the public domain. They're from the National Archives or from the Library of Congress. And I had to get them, high resolution digital versions of them. There were a few that I found and just got permit. People were very eager to have them appear in the book. So I was quite fortunate that way to,
Nice.
not to have it be the kind of end of the book nightmare where you're trying to clear permissions.
Yeah. So there's a question about the types of books that were the focus or the targets of different groups. Back to the materials that were eventually saved or sequestered or burned or whatever. Was there any kind of emphasis on locating rare books or specific science books, philosophy? You mentioned some bad fiction, not bad Nazi fiction that you've come across.
Yeah.
Or were there any, areas of, kind of fine books that were a focus of any of these groups?
Right. For the most part, they were interested in very timely newspapers. And this was hard to do. It was very hard to get them and then hard to reproduce them and send them on to Washington. They were looking for scientific and technical advances, patents, any reports, any of that kind of thing, especially, given the advanced German science in warfare and concerns about the bomb and, about, the atomic, whether they were advancing on the atomic bomb. The issue of, they were not supposed to collect rare books. They were not supposed to take books that were, that didn't have a Nazi content or a militaristic content, but they had book lust, the way that book lovers do. And some of them did, here's a book that's been signed by Hermann Goering with a beautiful binding, and they take it because it's been signed by Hermann Goering, so there was not an effort to collect those, but there's a kind of, collateral activity that was going on. There was one man involved in the library, before he was in the Library of Congress mission, he was just a private in the Army. He was a Rhodes Scholar, but a private, and he didn't have that, he was in intelligence, didn't have that much to do. He borrowed a Jeep and just started collecting Nazi ephemera and he created a collection with over 100,000 items, and his commanding officer gave him like shelf space in a warehouse. And ultimately these 100,000 items wound up in the Library of Congress. I mean, so, there'd be almost, sort of personal desires mixed in with the, official missions that they were on.
Right. So there's an interesting question about the German librarians and what role they may have played in assisting or not assisting. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yes. So there were many German librarians who were card-carrying Nazis and were not simply opportunistic, but they were believers. And one of them was the head of the Prussian State Library. And when Berlin fell to the Soviets, he committed suicide at the library. So there were plenty of those, and some who were not so affiliated that they couldn't be cleared. But there were a number who were kind of subversive. I mean, they were doing jobs as librarians, but who were themselves kind of subversive. There was this one man who himself was a German Jew and had been put in charge of organizing the SS collection of Jewish looted material. And somehow he managed to survive all this. He made his way to the Offenbach archival depot, and he was a font of information about book collections. He could sit and identify signatures, on books. And so there were people like that as well, and a number of German booksellers and librarians, publishers who maintained their affiliations with the Allies, even though they had to do business during the war years with the Germans.
Yeah. Are there any, you didn't tell a lot of specific, scandalous stories. Is there any, special story or a special photograph that you came across that really impacted you that you want to briefly share with us? Because we do want people to buy the book if they're interested. And I don't want you to give it all away. I did put the information in the chat about how to buy the book, and I'll send that out to everyone tomorrow. But, I thought maybe there's some special little tidbit that, you didn't share with us that you could tease us with a little bit, or I'm sure there was some kind of story that was emotional or, impactful in some way to you that, you could share with us.
Yeah, for me personally, I mean, as you can tell, I did a lot of digging and a lot of the material was not well organized. And at one point I was going through, and the OSS papers at the National Archives are a real mess because they first went to the CIA, who jumbled them up and then turned them over to the National Archives. There was an accordion file that on Bern, Switzerland, and Reuben Pisces went to Bern, Switzerland after Lisbon when Switzerland opened up. And at the bottom of this accordion file was a small carte de visite, a business card written from the head of the OSS in Lisbon, who was there, whose cover was attaché, legation attaché, to Alan Dulles, who was the head of the OSS in Bern, Switzerland, and later the head of the CIA. And there's a little writing on it that says, "This is to introduce Reuben Pisces. He's a good man. I'm sure you can put him to good use." And I think that I was just floored by that, because it was here, this was a card that had been handled by the head of the OSS in Lisbon, given to Reuben, taken to Switzerland, handled by Alan Dulles. So that, as a kind of material object, meant a lot to me.
Yeah, that's super personal and special. Obviously, the book club audience is, many of us are collectors and are interested in, rare books and fine books. Were there any special stories of a rare book, maybe a handwritten manuscript or something that was saved or rescued along the way, or returned, or even lost? A tragic story of a rare book that you came across?
Well, I'll tell you the story of my rare book, which is when I was in high school taking Latin, my father gave me a rare book. It's Spinoza's book on Descartes, and it was published in Amsterdam in, I think, the 1660s. And I've carried it with me everywhere since age 16. And I never really gave it much thought. But when I started this project, I took the book into our rare books librarian, and I said, "What can you tell me about this book?" And he did this kind of Antiques Roadshow. "Oh, that looks, well, that's rather rare, and, looked up its value and all that. But then he traced the book stamp on it. It had been part of an aristocratic library, the Schafgotsch Library in Wormbrunn, which is a spa town, Silesia. It had been, that library in 1945 was looted. Not clear exactly who took this book. It could have been Russians who came in. It could have been departing Germans who brought a number of other rare books there. I mean, this was part of the aristocrats' collection. It ultimately somehow got in Reuben Pisces' collection. That was his book, and it came to me when he died. He died, and then when I was in high school, my father gave it to me. So this is a book that traveled, from Silesia to probably to Berlin to California, and then in my hands, in my wanderings. So that was, I think it was a real lesson in, how books have lives and how they can be displaced, and they take on different meanings in different places.
Books have lives. That's a great quote. I always like to write down some special quotes along the way for each presentation, because we're about 10 minutes after, so we're going to wrap up in a second. But I just want to say that I loved how you started the whole presentation talking about information, like what information meant and was back then, and kind of what it is now, what it has become now, and how it's evolved and changed in maybe good ways and maybe some bad ways, and then the transfer of information and the coding of information. So that was really a great frame to start with. And then, of course, involving all the personal stories and the history about all of these great individuals I think there's a lot of great comments in the chat, which I will share with you, about how fascinating this presentation was. One of the best presentations they've attended. This was terrific. Great presentation. So lots of great feedback there. And I think, you really crafted a terrific presentation for a book club audience. So I do want to thank you for that. And people are thanking you in the chat as well. And I loved the part about, where's my notes, the strange position that many people were put in when they were defending freedom, but also destroying books. I think that's an important moment to bring us back to here as we wrap up. And that great slide, which had on the left said, "Books are weapons in the war of ideas," which is a terrific quote. Thank you for sharing that. And books cannot be killed by fire. Right, these ideas and thoughts cannot be killed by fire. So thanks for reminding us of that important element. Great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you want to say any last words before I wrap up here?
Oh, just thank you for being a great audience, and I can't wait to read all of the chat comments. And this has just been a thrill to be able to speak with you.
There are some very specific comments and chat questions that I didn't want to bring up because it might take us down a very specific rabbit hole or story. Tried to be a little more general, but I'll share those with you, including who asked those. And if you want to give me answers to get back to some folks, we can certainly do that. And in the email that will go out tomorrow, there is a link to Kathy's university webpage, which has her email and her phone number on it. If you want to call her or email her and follow up, you're welcome to do that. Kathy said it was okay to give you that page. So please feel free to follow up with Kathy when I send that email out tomorrow. So again, thank you so much for doing this talk this evening. And thank you everyone for attending this Book Club of California program. Please join us for our next online program titled A Journey into Steinbeck's California. That will be next Monday, September 20th from 5 to 6:15 p.m. here on Zoom. That's going to be a live online presentation by Susan Schillinglaw. She's an author and the professor of English at San Jose State University. And you can register for that event online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in the weekly programs emails that you may be receiving from the book club. So again, Kathy, thank you so much for this terrific presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be well and take care of yourselves. Thank you.